Our chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons. Rob, a quick overview of the fighting. Let's start with the attack in the west, in Yaroviv. Just how significant is that? Is it symbolic as well?
Well, it's certainly significant because we haven't seen these sort of attacks so close to Lviv, the main Ukrainian city in the western part of the country. 700,000 people, not very far away from the city.
Yeah, a cultural capital and a transport hub.
Yeah, exactly. This is the main point. 24 hours ago, the Russians were warning that supply convoys coming in from Poland, bringing weaponry into Ukraine, would be regarded by the Russians as legitimate targets. This seems to be the first step in that direction. I'm not saying at this stage that this particular place was part of that effort by the West to supply Ukraine with weaponry, but it does seem at least plausible it would have been the case. No fighting as yet we're seeing. We're seeing rocket attacks. These are missile strikes on this base, and also on Ivano-Frankivsk further to the south, about 100 kilometers to the south, where the airport for the third successive day was targeted by the Russians. So you can begin to see a pattern where the Russians are trying to expand the range of their attacks from northern, central and southern Ukraine further west as well, so that nowhere is going to be safe from their attacks.
Yeah, after that attack in Yaroviv, we've even heard from a Ukrainian MP that said it's just a matter of time till Russia attacks Poland. I think we're probably quite a ways from that, but it just shows how people are fearing about what Russia's next move is.
Well, it will certainly be a concern. With those weapons coming across the border, obviously Poland's the main entry point. There are others as well, but Poland, a major NATO member.
Yep.
There's no doubt that if this war in Ukraine develops, that there is a danger that Poland could be sucked into the conflict.
Yeah, and Rob, when you look at that map that we have up on air right now, what are Russian forces doing strategically in Ukraine?
Well, there are a number of different aims, I think. Well, one of them is clearly to encircle Kiev. They're not making much progress there. They've not made much progress on the northeast either with Kharkiv. They would like to take Kharkiv or to be able to surround it and move their troops further south, with the aim, I think, of meeting up with troops coming up from the south, driving north, and also from the east. The aim being to encircle Ukrainian forces which are in the eastern part of the country and take them out of the military equation. They're a long way from achieving that yet, but it certainly seems something that they'll be trying to do. And if, from the Ukrainian perspective, things look as though they're getting bad in the south, north and east, they may want to retreat, bringing their troops out of those areas so that they don't get encircled.
And the stalled progress we're seeing in the capital, is that from poor planning on Vladimir Putin's part, or is that more credit to the resistance?
Undoubtedly, it's a combination of all those things. The Russians quite clearly were not expecting the Ukrainian resistance to be as strong and as effective and well organized as it is. And that is in large part because Vladimir Putin has been listening only to the information he wants to hear. So I think he thought that this operation, this war would be over in 3 days. Quite clearly, it's not going to be 3 days. He'll be lucky if it's 3 months, if even that. At the moment, things are not looking good for him. The advance, as we were just hearing from the north on Kiev, has stalled at the moment. And not just stalled, it is being attacked all the time by the Ukrainians. Morale in the Russian army is reported to be very bad at the moment. The Ukrainians were claiming just over 24 hours ago that 500 to 600 Russian troops surrendered to the Ukrainians. This is not good for the Russians. When you hear them talking about bringing in Syrians, for instance, who've been fighting on there with them in Syria, that is not a good sign. If Russia has got to the point where not only is it not relying on its own conscripts, but relying on bringing in foreigners, that suggests that the condition of the Russian army is very poor indeed.
Yeah, foreigners, also possible mercenaries. Rob, you're a week back from having reported in Ukraine. We talk about morale being low with the Russian forces. It seems to be perhaps quite high with the Ukrainians. Zelensky repeatedly saying that Ukraine has never been more united than they are now.
On that, there is absolutely no doubt at all. The morale of the Ukrainians, everywhere I went, was enormously high. Obviously, for those who are fleeing the country, the women and children, the elderly, it's dispiriting, to say the least. Their lives have been upended, destroyed in many respects.
Yeah, families separated.
But they are determined as well in their own ways. They're leaving the men to fight behind they're with them, but they're having to get out of the way. The men that I spoke to a man, I never met anybody who was dispirited. Everybody was either going to try and get a weapon to fight with, joining up with the Territorial Defence Organisation, going along to train with the Territorial Defence. You know, the idea was to make sure that the army, the regular army, could be at the front and doing the brunt of the fighting, while they keep the rear and ensure that there is security in the rear.
And then we heard from Ukraine's president today, Volodymyr Zelensky, sort of outlining what he thinks Russia's plans are for territory that it has seized in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, we've seen the playbook that the Russians have used in the past in Crimea and also in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk. They create these regions, that they hold referenda in the regions to give a veneer of respectability, and then claim that these are independent or semi-autonomous, or whatever they want to call them. The idea being to try to undermine the solidarity of the Ukrainian state. That is what they'll try to achieve. They didn't get very far, haven't got very far so far with Donetsk and Luhansk, despite the amount of effort they've put into propping those two regions up. In Crimea, a different story, obviously much more successful there. But you know, even there, when it comes to diplomatic recognition, international recognition, nobody has accepted, apart from one or two states around the world, the incorporation of Crimea into the Russian Federation.
Indeed. Well, let's look a little bit more about Russia's alleged plans for territory it captures in Ukraine. Solange Moujon has more on the tactics being employed, but also what's being met with resistance.
Chanting "Free our mayor," some 2,000 residents of Melitopol came out despite the presence of Russian troops to demand the release of their leader. For on Friday, an unverified CCTV video was released. In it, at the top of the screen, a man who's thought to be the mayor, Ivan Fedorov, is seen carted away by Russian soldiers. Ukraine's president condemned the kidnapping and called France and Germany for help in pressing Russia for Fedorov's release. The mayor of Kyiv also condemned the abduction.
The occupiers left the city without its elected leader to paralyze Melitopol and to demoralize and conquer its local residents. This is an act of terrorism.
Local television announced that Galina Danilchenko, a former council member, was named the new mayor of the Russian-occupied city. Unelected and thought to be in allegiance with Moscow, she vowed to get Melitopol back to normal. Abducting and replacing local officials is just one of Russia's tactics, according to President Zelensky. There's also murder. Last week, the mayor of Gostomel was shot and killed while distributing bread. And then there are plans for so-called referendums in areas already seized by Russia, like Kherson. Located on the Black Sea, it's a strategic port, and it was one of the first cities to fall to Russian forces, even amidst widespread protests. On Saturday, President Zelensky accused Moscow of planning a fake vote there.
The invaders in the Kherson region are trying to repeat the sad experience of forming pseudo-republics.
On social media, the deputy head of the local council blasted the attempt to turn Kherson into a breakaway republic. He wrote it would turn the region into a hopeless hole with no life or future.
Well, anti-war protests have been held across Europe. Some of the latest images coming in from Berlin. There is anger about the violence Vladimir Putin has unleashed in Ukraine, unease about whether he has ambitions beyond Ukraine. Already, the war is the biggest in Europe since 1945, and protesters turning out at Russian embassies across Europe. Kamil Nedelek has a look at some of the other protests that have taken place.
Europe's leaders may shy away from a no-fly zone over Ukraine, but Europe's people had no such qualms, with protesters in Vienna demanding for Ukrainian skies to be protected and calling Russian President Vladimir Putin a murderer. In Munich, around 1,000 people gathered to call for tougher sanctions against Russia.
This brutal war violates international law and must be condemned in the strongest possible terms.
I want even more decisiveness and even tougher sanctions. We have to take everything into consideration. Everything possible must be done.
Ukrainians gathered in front of the Cypriot parliament, urging Cyprus to support Ukraine's request to join the EU.
Ukraine is part of Europe.
Polish protesters marched through the streets of Warsaw under the banner "Russians Stop Killing Kids" and demonstrated in front of the Russian embassy. According to Ukraine, almost 100 children have died in the conflict so far. In Spain, Russians also protested in front of their embassy, blaming President Putin for the crisis.
We want Putin removed from office because he's not a president, he's a dictator like Hitler.
Demonstrators in Florence were in the Santa Croce Square, where they watched a message from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, also broadcast to several other European cities, in which he urged Europe to do more to help.
But there's also anger in Russia. Look at these images coming in from Moscow. Anti-war protests in the capital, anger against the Kremlin's actions in Ukraine. There have been protests at dozens of cities recently in Russia, and thousands of people have been detained amid those protests. There's been a crackdown on dissent. State media pushing propaganda, while independent media have been stifled. But it seems that the more truth gets out about Russia's invasion, the more some Russians are willing to say goodbye to their homeland. This report comes from Istanbul.
Istanbul has become the new home for many Russians opposed to Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, including Nagina. She worked as an independent journalist in Moscow, but decided to flee for her safety.
Самое сложное, наверное, решение в моей жизни, оно принималось быстро. Но на самом деле я же не знала, что я просто собрала один чемодан, я взяла свою камеру и уехала.
A new law in Russia threatens up to 15 years in prison for spreading false information about the invasion of Ukraine. Many of the country's journalists have since headed to Turkey, which doesn't require a visa for Russian tourists.
Но мы не предатели, мы любим Россию, и мы хотим вернуться домой. Но именно домой, а не в путинскую Россию.
Nagina continues to report in Istanbul, filming other Russian exiles. Masha is an anti-war activist and worked as a theater director in St. Petersburg, where her partner remains stuck.
I'm really afraid of my boyfriend because he can be actually, sent to the army. But at least for now, I think he's safe. So, we have the choice, jail or army.
Entire Russian families have also made the trip. Vlad and Maria, who oppose Putin, work in cinema. They fled with their baby and are now staying with a friend.
I cleaned my computer because I'm also producing some resistant films, documentary films against the regime. So those files I had to take. I was afraid.
The family continues its resistance in Istanbul. In Russia, unauthorized protests are banned.
In Russia, I wouldn't be free now physically, and I wouldn't have any chance just to have maybe some small but voice.
With EU airspace closed to Russian aircraft, Istanbul is likely to remain a key destination for Russians looking to escape the Kremlin's intensifying crackdown on free speech.
Well, nearly 2.6 million people have fled Ukraine, already Europe's biggest refugee crisis since World War II. Poland hosting over half of the Ukrainian refugees. There, border guards said 1.6 million people have arrived. A second wave of refugee arrivals seems to be ebbing slowly. For more, let's speak to France 24's Emmanuel Chaz, standing by on the Polish border in the town of Przemyśl. Hello to you, Emmanuel. For 2 weeks now, you've been on the Polish border. A lot of charities and foreign volunteers really shouldering the relief efforts. Tell us more.
Well, indeed, there's been an ever-growing number of people coming through the border. It simply doesn't stop. I'm here in front of the station of Przemyśl, where you can see people waiting to be transferred to other cities by bus, by trains. Here today it's relatively quiet, but 2 nights ago people were sleeping within the station because the trains were simply completely full. They had to wait for the next one, and of course, course, even if the Polish authorities are doing their utmost to try and take care of everyone, they are simply overwhelmed. So we do witness the arrival more and more of foreign NGOs and even individual volunteers who come here to try and alleviate the work that has to do the Polish government. People coming from France, people coming from America, Ireland, Great Britain, China and India are coming here to try and provide some logistics, psychological, medical help to people who arrive here.